The hostess didn't know it yet, but the woman she had just turned away owned the entire restaurant. And within the next hour, every person who had ignored her standing at that marble podium would realize something that would change their careers forever. Because the quiet woman they dismissed wasn't just another guest looking for dinner. She was the new owner, and she had been watching everything. Margaret Ellison had never needed loud introductions. At 61 years old, she had built a reputation that echoed through boardrooms and investment firms across 3 states. People in the hospitality industry knew her name well. She was the kind of executive who could walk into a failing business and quietly turn it into a thriving one within a year. But the public rarely saw her face. Margaret preferred it that way. She believed power worked best when it didn't need to announce itself. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood outside Atlanta, the daughter of a school librarian and a mechanic. Her parents weren't wealthy, but they were disciplined, patient people who believed in one thing above all else: dignity. Her father used to tell her something she never forgot. "Some people will judge you before they know you," he said once while fixing an old truck in their driveway. "But character has a funny way of outlasting assumptions." Margaret carried those words with her through college, through business school, and through decades of hard work. At 35, she founded Ellison Hospitality Ventures, a company that specialized in buying struggling luxury restaurants and restoring them to excellence. Her philosophy was simple. Beautiful buildings meant nothing if the culture inside them was broken. And over the years, she proved that philosophy worked. By the time she turned 60, Margaret owned 18 upscale restaurants across the country. But one particular place had always stayed in the back of her mind: a restaurant called the Ivory Room. Located in the heart of Chicago, it was famous for its towering crystal chandeliers, velvet booths, and a reputation for exclusivity that bordered on arrogance. Years ago, when Margaret was still a college student, she had applied there for a part-time hostess job. The interview had lasted less than 3 minutes. The manager had smiled politely and said she wasn't quite the look they were going for. She remembered walking out into the cold Chicago evening feeling embarrassed, but also strangely determined. She told herself one thing that night: one day she would come back, not as an employee, but as the owner. 30 years later, that promise quietly became reality. Through a holding company, Margaret had recently purchased a controlling share of the Ivory Room. The official announcement would happen during a private management dinner later that evening. Only the senior staff knew ownership was changing. None of them knew who the new owner was. Margaret preferred it that way. Culture reveals itself best when it doesn't know it's being observed. So she made a simple reservation under her real name, and she arrived alone. The restaurant glowed with warm golden light as she stepped inside. The polished marble floors reflected the chandeliers above, and soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Well-dressed couples chatted over wine. Waiters moved smoothly between tables. Everything looked elegant. But Margaret wasn't there to admire the decor. She walked calmly to the host's stand. A young hostess with a tight bun and a practiced smile greeted her. "Good evening," Margaret said politely. "Reservation for Margaret Ellison." The hostess typed into her tablet. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then something shifted. The hostess paused. Her eyes moved from the screen to Margaret's face, then back again. The smile faded just slightly. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "It looks like we're completely full tonight." Margaret remained calm. "That's unusual," she replied gently. "I confirmed the reservation 2 days ago." The hostess pretended to search again. "Oh, strange," she said flatly. "I'm not seeing anything." Margaret reached into her bag and produced the confirmation email on her phone. The hostess glanced at it. Then something happened that several nearby guests noticed immediately. She printed the reservation slip, looked at it,
and slowly tore it in half. "Oh," she said casually, "must have been a mistake." Behind Margaret, two young men in designer jackets approached the host stand. "No reservation," one of them said. "Not a problem," the hostess replied brightly. Within seconds, they were escorted to a table. Margaret didn't say a word, but she noticed something. Several tables in the dining room were clearly empty. Reserved signs sat on them like decorations. The message was obvious and deliberate. A few minutes later, the general manager approached. His name was Richard Dalton, mid-40s, immaculate suit, confident posture. "Good evening," he said with a thin smile. "I understand there was a reservation issue?" Margaret nodded calmly. Richard barely glanced at her. "Well, unfortunately, we're at capacity tonight. Perhaps you could try somewhere nearby." It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he dismissed her. Margaret simply nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Instead of leaving, she walked to the bar and ordered sparkling water. And then she watched. For the next 30 minutes, she observed everything. A black couple was told they'd have to wait despite open tables. A Hispanic family was discouraged from dining because their party was too large. Meanwhile, a social media influencer was greeted like royalty and seated immediately. The patterns were subtle, but they were unmistakable. Margaret's expression never changed. Finally, she sent a short text message. "Come now. Bring the documents." 10 minutes later, she stood up and walked back to the host's stand. "I'd like to speak with your manager again," she said politely. Richard returned, clearly irritated. "Yes?" Margaret opened her leather folder and placed several documents on the marble counter. Legal documents, ownership contracts, signed and finalized that morning. Richard skimmed the first page. His face turned pale. The hostess looked over his shoulder. Her eyes widened in shock. Margaret spoke calmly. "My name is Margaret Ellison. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Ellison Hospitality Ventures, and as of today, the majority owner of this establishment." The restaurant fell eerily quiet. Conversations stopped. People stared. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She simply continued. "My legal team has already accessed the security footage. There's no misunderstanding." Silence spread through the restaurant. Then Margaret said something no one expected. "Effective immediately, the entire front-of-house management team is terminated." Gasps rippled through the room. The hostess looked like she might faint. Richard stood frozen. Margaret turned to the remaining staff. "This is not about punishment," she said. "It's about standards." Her voice softened slightly. Hospitality should never depend on someone's appearance, status, or assumptions. Anyone here who is willing to uphold fairness, professionalism, and respect will be retrained and given the opportunity to stay. For a moment, no one moved. Then a server stepped forward. "I'd like to stay," he said quietly. Another nodded. Then another. Something in the room had shifted. Not just power, but culture. Over the next few months, the Ivory Room changed dramatically. Margaret implemented new training programs focused on fairness and respect. Clear seating policies replaced vague discretion. Hiring practices expanded. Community partnerships were formed. Within 6 months, revenue increased by nearly 40%. Customer reviews described something new, not just elegance, but warmth and dignity. The restaurant's reputation grew stronger than ever. Margaret never spoke publicly about what happened that night. She didn't give interviews. She didn't embarrass the people involved. Because for her, the goal was never revenge. It was correction. Sometimes injustice doesn't appear as cruelty. Sometimes it hides behind polite smiles, policies, and quiet exclusion. But dignity has a way of revealing the truth. Years later, Margaret still visits the Ivory Room occasionally. She sits quietly at a corner table. No announcements, no special treatment. Just another guest enjoying dinner. Because real power doesn't demand attention. It simply makes sure the door stays open for everyone who walks through it. And for anyone who has ever been told they didn't belong somewhere, sometimes the greatest answer isn't arguing at the door. Sometimes it's owning the building. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Cold Justice and tell us where you're watching from by dropping your city in the comments.